Welcome to our video series of getting your cloud engineering hands dirty with EMA. This is a video series providing solutions to different AWS cloud engineering and security configuration issues, such as alert remediation, infrastructure configuration, and application deployment. This is our first episode. In this episode, we will look at how to remediate AWS EBS volume alerts. There are multiple AWS EBS volume alerts that you might get in real world. However, the first that we will look at today is called the EBS volume default encryption. The description of the EBS volume default encryption policy may vary, depends on the company or individual who configures it. Let's look at the likely EBS volume default encryption description that you might see in real life. An EBS volume default encryption description might look like this. 1. AWS EBS volume region with encryption is disabled. 2. You might see a description that looks like this. Default EBS volume encryption not enabled. Or AWS EBS volume description encryption at region level is disabled. Finally, you might see something like this. Ensure to set default encryption for EBS volume. Whichever one you see, or you see something else, depends on your environment or your organization or an individual in your organization that configure the EBS volume default encryption policy. What does it mean? All of this simply means one thing, that you do not turn on automatic encryption for new Amazon EBS volumes and snapshot copies created in your account. I repeat, what all this policy description means is that you do not turn on automatic encryption for new Amazon EBS volume and snapshot copies created in your account. Meaning that when somebody creates an EBS volume, either somebody or a service creates an EBS volumes or a snapshot copies in your AWS account in a particular region, if the person do not explicitly click on EBS volume, that means the volume or the snapshot will not be encrypted. If you do not have automatic encryption enabled in your AWS account, let's see what is going to happen. The effect of not enabling automatic encryption of EBS volume. 1. When you create a new EBS volume in your AWS account, that EBS volume will not be encrypted if encryption box is not explicitly selected. Second, if you create a snapshot from an EBS volume that is not encrypted, that snapshot too will not be encrypted. So let's go to our AWS account and let's review, let's practicalize or demonstrate the effects of not having EBS volume enabled, EBS volume default encryption enabled in your AWS account. But before we go to the AWS account, let's see what we are going to demonstrate. 1, we are going to create an EBS volume without specifying the encryption key. And secondly, we are going to review the EBS volume that we created, and the EBS volume should show unencrypted. Also, we are also going to demonstrate snapshot volumes. And what we are going to do is that we are going to create a snapshot volume from an EBS volume that is not encrypted. And also, we are going to review the snapshot volume, and the snapshot volume created should also show unencrypted. Now, this is my home page of my AWS account. The first place I want to go is go to EC2 here. Click on this EC2. But if you don't have the EC2 as your favorite, if you don't have it check as your favorite, just search for EC2 from the search box. So if you have EC2 here, click on it. Now that I am on my EC2 page, so if you want to check if you have EBS default encryption enabled, if you want to check if you have it enabled, go to account attributes. By the left side, by the right side, you will see account attributes. Click under the account attributes, go to settings, then click on data protection and security. When you click on data protection and security, if you see EBS encryption disabled, that means you do not have automatic EBS volume encryption enabled. So what would happen if you don't have an EBS encryption enabled automatically? Let's go and create an EBS volume and let's see if this is disabled, what will happen to the EBS volume that you create that you do not specify an encryption key. So go to the Elastic Block Store, then click on EBS volume. Click on the volume. So now currently I don't have any EBS volume, so I'm going to click on create a volume. So I'm not going to modify or change anything here except the size. So I'm going to change the size to 8 gig. Then I'm going to save. If you notice here under the encryption, I do not check this box. So if I do not check this box and the automatic EBS encryption is disabled, what is going to happen? Let's create this and let's see the encryption status of this EBS volume. If you scroll to the right, you will see that the encryption is not encrypted, meaning that this EBS volume is not encrypted. And the reason it's not encrypted is because I do not check the encryption box. So what this means is that someone in your AWS account or somebody that has access to your AWS account, either as an individual or your organization AWS account, can create an EBS volume without encryption. And this is not the security best practice. So let's also demonstrate the snapshots. So we are going to create a snapshot from this EBS volume that we just created, and let's see the status, the encryption status of that snapshot as well. So I'm going to click on create a snapshot. Then I'm selecting the EBS volume because I'm creating the snapshot from the EBS volume that I created initially. So you can automatically see here that it's also showing not encrypted because we are creating a snapshot from an EBS volume that is not encrypted. Snapshot is just like a copy of your data that is stored in the EBS volume. So when the data in the EBS volume is not encrypted, the copy that you get from it, which is your snapshot, would also not be encrypted. So when I create this, and let's go and check the encryption status of this snapshot. If you go to the encryption, this is the snapshot, look at it too, is not encrypted. So this is the problem that companies have, and when they have a lot of EBS volume in their AWS account that is not encrypted, this is not a good security best practice. Let's look at the company challenges or business challenges of not having an EBS volume encryption before we come back and see how can we enforce automatic encryption for our EBS volume. So the business challenge of not having automatic EBS volume encryption or of not explicitly encrypt an EBS volume or a snapshot that you created in your account. First, you are going to have multiple unencrypted EBS volume in your AWS account. Secondly, you are going to have multiple unencrypted snapshots in your AWS account. Apart from this, also, when you have an EBS volume or a snapshot in your account already that has been used by a service such as EC2 instance, or they are just standalone EBS volume or snapshot, when you want to now encrypt this already existing EBS volume, the process is a daunting task. The process of encrypting already existing or in use EBS volume or a snapshot is a daunting task, and also it's time consuming. It is time consuming. And if you want to do this programmatically, it's complex. Encrypting an already existing EBS volume or a snapshot is complex if done programmatically. So now, let's go back to our AWS account and via the console, and let's enforce automatic encryption so that whoever created an EBS volume or a snapshot in our AWS account, even if they do not select encryption while they are creating the EBS volume would automatically be encrypted with the default KMS key that we set. Now, in the AWS account, this is the steps that we are going to follow. The first step is that we are going to go to our AWS management console. Then we search for EC2 service page. When we get to the EC2 service page, we are going to locate account attributes. Under the account attributes, go to settings, then click data protection and security. On the settings page, on the data protection and security tab, go to EBS encryption and click manage. Then check the enable checkbox to enable encryption. Then select the KMS key that you want to use for this encryption. So now I will go back to my AWS account. Now that we are on our AWS account, I'm going to click on the EC2 dashboard so that I can go back to the EC2 page. Now that I am on the EC2 page, I will go to the account attributes. Under the account attributes, I will go to settings, then data protection and security. Now that I am on data protection and security, ensure that the data protection and security tab is selected. Then scroll down, and under the EBS encryption, click on manage. Then check the enable box and select the default KMS key that you want for this automatic encryption. If the key that you are seeing on the screen is not the one that you want to use, just highlight it or delete the key. Once you start deleting the key, it's going to show other KMS key that you have in your AWS account in that particular region. Then select any key that you want to use. I'm still going to with the default key. Then once you select the key that you're going to use, then click update. Before I click update, I want to point your attention to something. Look at this region. We are currently in North Virginia region. What this means is that we are only setting this EBS encryption default, or we are only setting this default EBS encryption in North Virginia. Every other region will still be having their default EBS encryption disabled. If you want the same settings in every region, you have to go to that region and automatically do the same thing. You have to go to each of the region and also turn the encryption on. So if you want to do this manually, that is, if you want to do it via the console like this, is a daunting task, meaning that you have to go to each of the region that you have and you have to manually turn it on like this. So this is not a cost. I mean, this is not a best operational optimization task or experience that you want to have. So what's the best options to do this is to use AWS CLI together with bash scripting. If you want me to create this same solution using AWS CLI together with bash scripting and turn on the automatic encryption for all the region with a new key created, then put it in the comment section that you want me to also create the same solution using AWS CLI with bash scripting to turn on default EBS encryption for all the region in a specific AWS account, and I'm going to do that. So now let's continue. I'm going to click on update EBS encryption. Now that I've updated the EBS encryption, if you scroll down, you can see now that it is showing that always encrypt new EBS volume is enabled and is using this key as the default encryption key. So now what I'm going to do to demonstrate that we now have automatic encryption is to go and create a new EBS volume now that we have automatic encryption enabled. So here I'm going to click on volumes. This is the initial volume that we created earlier. So I'm going to create a new volume. If the initial volume that we created earlier is having not encrypted, so I'm creating a new volume now. The same thing, I'm going to leave the default settings except the size. I'm changing the size to 8 gig. So every other thing will remain the same. Then I'm clicking create. So now, if you go to the new EBS volume that we just created, which is this one, because it's showing that it's still creating. So once we scroll to the encryption status, you can now see that it is automatically encrypted, even though we do not explicitly select encryption. Then the same thing goes to snapshot. If you scroll down and go to snapshot and also create a snapshot from an encrypted EBS, the snapshot too will be automatically encrypted. So let's go and create a snapshot. So you can see the snapshots, I'm not doing any changes except that I'm selecting a volume from which I will create the snapshot. So the volume that I'm using is this second volume. And if you scroll down, you can automatically see that it's showing encrypted. So I'm going to click it snapshot. And if you scroll to the left, and you see automatically it is encrypted. So this is the best option, or this is the best practice, making sure that every data that is stored in your EBS or your snapshots, which are data at rest, they are automatically encrypted. Now let me take you back to the presentation and show you what happens to our data when we have EBS encrypted. When we have the EBS volume encrypted, what happens to the data in the EBS volume? When you have an EBS volume encrypted, the first thing is that when you create an EBS volume, when you create an encrypted EBS volume and attach it to an instance, the following types of data are encrypted. One, the data at rest inside the EBS volume. The data inside an EBS volume is automatically encrypted when that EBS volume is encrypted. Two, all data that are moving between the EBS volume and the EC2 instance, all the data which are data in transit are also encrypted. Third, all snapshots created from the EBS volume are also encrypted. Fourth, all volumes created from the snapshot also will also be encrypted. Then, so this is how to enforce automatic EBS volume encryption in your AWS account. So if you want me to, as I said earlier, that if you want me to create the same solution using AWS CLI and bash scripting, please put it in the comment section that you want me to create the same solution using AWS CLI and bash scripting. And these are the options that I can create. I can create an AWS CLI with default KMS key, the same solution with AWS CLI with default KMS key, or I can also create the same solution with AWS CLI using a default custom key. I can use a custom key in a specific region. And thirdly, I can also create the same solution with AWS CLI using custom key in all the regions. And this third one is the best option if you want to set an automatic encryption in your AWS account so that you can have encryption in all the regions. All right. So thank you for watching our first AWS Alert Remediation Series Episode 1. For more tips and tricks on managing AWS Alert, don't forget to subscribe and turn on your notifications. Stay secure and see you in the next episode. Thank you. Bye.